Hi, I'm Keith Boag from the CBC's Bureau in Washington. Thanks for joining us for another Facebook Live. Today we're going to talk about the President's decision to fire the Director of the FBI yesterday, to fire James Comey. Now, just to review the events before we get the chat going, the announcement came as a surprise in a statement from the President that was accompanied by a statement from the Deputy Attorney General. The Deputy Attorney General. Saying that because he felt, the Deputy Attorney General, that the Director of the FBI, James Comey, had lost the confidence of the people who work with him in the FBI, that there was no other solution to that problem than that Comey should go. And he included the opinions of other attorneys general from both the Democratic and Republican side, from different states and so on, to back up his opinion. All of that was linked to the campaign statements made, or the statements made during the campaign by James Comey about the investigation into Hillary Clinton's email server, which you might remember from last July, when he said that in his opinion and the opinion of those whose advice he had sought, while Hillary Clinton had done many things that were reckless and irresponsible and wrong, there was no reasonable chance of prosecuting her, and so that was not going to happen. Later in the campaign, when he reopened the investigation just days before the November 8th vote, that was one of the most controversial moments in the election campaign. Some still believe it affected the outcome. So because of those two things, which were very unusual for James Comey to do, for the director of any director of the FBI to do, there had been a cloud over Comey's head that was acknowledged by both Democrats and Republicans. But the decision to fire him nevertheless came out of the blue, because it seemed to have come so long after those events took place that it raised questions as to whether that was really the motive behind the President's decision. So that's the context of the decision that we're going to be discussing today. You may ask your questions. I will try to answer them. You may have your comments. If that generates other discussion that I can moderate, or just take note of your comments, I'll be happy to do that. As soon as we get some questions going, and I think we have some here, we'll begin. The first question from Nicholas Zendrowski is, what is the precedent for this kind of action? Well, there is no precedent for this kind of action at all. There has never been a case where a president who is under an investigation by the FBI has fired the director of the FBI. There is a case where President Bill Clinton fired the director of the FBI, but that was for ethical reasons that didn't really cause any political backlash at all. The director at that time was seen to have behaved inappropriately in matters unrelated to his job. And so there was no question that he had to go, and when Clinton fired him, it was not controversial. There are a lot of ties being drawn to what happened during the Nixon-Watergate investigations, and that is an appropriate analogy to a certain extent. It's not a perfect analogy, but at that time, Richard Nixon was being investigated by a special prosecutor, Archibald Cox, because of the Watergate break-in and all of the subsequent findings of the investigation there. On what's remembered now as a consequential night, the Saturday Night Massacre, the president directed the firing of Archibald Cox. That created a huge firestorm politically on the Hill between the Republicans and uniting Republicans and Democrats, I should say, but it also changed the level of support for that investigation, and ultimately for Nixon's impeachment. For the first time, the days after his firing of Archibald Cox, support for impeachment achieved a plurality in the United States, and within the year, Nixon was forced to resign. So those are the things that people are talking about in the context of what happened yesterday. But again, just the straight answer, no, there is no precedent for what the president decided to do yesterday. So let's have another question. Adam Taylor asks, can I commit a crime and fire the detective in charge? That's not really a question, is it, Adam? Of course you can't. But that's the way a lot of people not everyone, but that is the way that some people are constructing the criticism of what Donald Trump did yesterday, that he is being investigated, did not like the course of that investigation, perhaps had something to hide, and used the power of his office to fire the investigator in that case. Again, not a perfect analogy, but that is why some people think that this is a huge event. Terence Graham asks, is the president in need of an intervention, do you think? I think a lot of people might think something should happen. What kind of intervention that would mean? I mean, we've heard this in different kinds of contexts, from as little as someone should intervene and tell him to get off Twitter, to someone should intervene because there has been an abuse of power here. There is insufficient evidence for the latter case right now. The president is within his rights to act as he did. The excuse that he gave for acting as he did is a legitimate excuse, even if it's not a believable excuse in the context of today's circumstances in many people's minds. But I think that's enough for me to say about that. Joanne Christine Brydbildson asks, what did the FBI agent do wrong, or is there a hidden agenda? I think Democrats and Republicans, perhaps at different times, have both agreed that James Comey behaved inappropriately in the public statements that he made and the way that he released to the public information about the investigation into Hillary Clinton's email server on 2 occasions. In July, when the FBI wrapped up their investigation into that, James Comey held a news conference, and during that time, he essentially excoriated her, said her behavior had been reckless, but nevertheless decided that there was insufficient reason to prosecute her. The second time was when he reopened the investigation that he had ostensibly closed in July. That was in October of last year, just 11 days before, I think it was 11 days before the election. Democrats howled at that because they believed that it would have an impact on the election and that there were clear policies within the FBI that they should be very careful and refrain from making any kinds of public statements that could have a political impact in the context of an election. And so he was heavily criticized for having said those things or having allowed those things to become public. Those were the reasons that the Deputy Attorney General decided that Comey had to go, made that recommendation to the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions. He agreed, and the President accepted their recommendations, he said. So that's the context for that. You had another part to your question, which is there a hidden agenda? This is the question that the Democrats and some Republicans want to know, whether the real motivation for Trump firing the director of the FBI was in fact connected to the investigation the FBI is doing into the possibility of collusion between the Trump election campaign and the Russian government last year. So just to remind you, we're talking about the firing yesterday of James Comey by the President of the United States. It was an unprecedented action. We still don't know what the full repercussions of that are going to be as the story is still unfolding. So I will try to answer your questions, but it may not be possible to answer all of them. Can Comey appeal the firing? I don't know for certain the answer to that, but I'm 99.9% certain that he cannot. He serves at the pleasure of the President. He is nominated by the President. He is confirmed by the Senate, and then his tenure as FBI director is normally 10 years. And it's 10 years because of a specific reason. It's 10 years because because all election cycles have regular intervals. The President's election cycle is every 4 years. Congress is every 2 years. The Senate is 1/3 gets elected every 6 years. But there is no one whose electoral cycle outlasts the director of the FBI. So that is to insulate him from any feelings of political pressure. John Bakator asks via YouTube, how likely will an independent prosecutor or commission be put in place? I think the pressure of that is going to be tremendous now. You'll hear much more of it through the day. There are Republicans who are calling for either one of those things or the other of those things. Let me just add that both parties in the last 40 years have had bitter experiences with the appointment of special prosecutors. I think there is more likely a chance that they could come to an agreement of a commission, something like the commission that investigated 9/11, than there is that they'll get an agreement to have a special prosecutor. There was a special prosecutor who investigated Bill Clinton, and he used the pretext of an investigation into his financial dealings to eventually find that he could recommend impeachment of Bill Clinton for his sexual misbehavior in the White House, which is about as far removed from the original investigation as you could imagine. And the other special prosecutor, of course, was the one that investigated Richard Nixon, which ended badly for that president. So my sense of it is that there'll be a lot of talk about that today. I don't think we'll see it necessarily today. And I think it depends to a great extent how Republicans view the public mood for further investigation into this, because of course they control the apparatus right now. It will be largely up to them what happens next. Jared Sarah Gertson asks, I hope I got that pronunciation right, what checks and balances does the US president have outside of his authority? Well, you often hear that there are co-equal branches of the government. That is the Congress, the House, and the Senate. It's also the Supreme Court. So, you know, those are the things that can restrict a president's ability to act simply as he pleases. How they will behave, particularly in political questions, and this is a very political question, depends very much again on what kind of support there is in the public for what the president is doing. And if there is no support for what the president is doing, that will embolden those who control the other houses of Congress. That is the Republicans. Embolden is probably not the right word, but that would be a signal to them, at least, that the public takes this very seriously, and it's not going to be inconsequential for Republicans if they ignore the public concern about that. On the other hand, if the public doesn't care, I mean, that is such an essential ingredient for politicians proceeding on any measure, even something like this, that it could have a profound impact on what the next step is going to be. Bob Metcalf asks, a hand-delivered letter was delivered to FBI headquarters in Washington. Did they not know he was in California? Why did the media get the letters and broadcast them before Comey had been advised he was fired? I think what you're saying is true. The letter was sent by a security person who works for the president to the FBI headquarters here. They apparently did not know that James Comey was in Los Angeles at the time, but they did release that information to the media in short order. So, you know, it wasn't a question of the media finding this out or leaking it or being leaked to the media. It was a statement, a public statement by the president with attached documents. All of it apparently done without knowing that James Comey did not yet have information about what was happening to him. So, I mean, they've been criticized sharply and harshly for that, but you know, I don't think it's something you can blame on the media. Certainly you can't blame it on James Comey for not being there. So it seems to be something that they didn't check into properly. Terrence Graham asks, do you think this is a big deal like Nixon times or something different here? Well, I mean, there are a number of different things to look at before you can answer that question, and some of them we don't know yet. First of all, the comparison to Nixon is being made again because it appears that the president might be trying to avoid investigation by firing the investigator. One of the reasons people believe that is that the statements that Donald Trump made about James Comey during the election campaign and his behavior on this investigation of Hillary Clinton's email server were strikingly positive, strikingly supportive. And since the election, he has said that, or he has confirmed that he invited Comey to continue as director of the FBI. Very recently in a television interview, he said that that Comey enjoyed his full support. So it's not clear what has changed with regard to how Comey handled the investigation into Hillary Clinton's email server. It appears nothing has changed in regard to that, yet that is used as the explanation for why the president acted as he did yesterday. It is not at all surprising that many people reacted almost instantly by saying this has more to do with the investigation into Trump and Russia than it has to do with that email investigation. I'm not sure if you had another question there. Is it like Nixon times or something? You know, I think what we need to look for next is who does the president nominate to fill James Comey's spot? That will tell you a lot, I think, about how this story is going to unfold. If he chooses someone who is unimpeachably independent and serious about investigation, even in the minds of Democrats, that I think would add some, that would restore some credibility and integrity to the FBI in this, but also it would perhaps alleviate the suspicion about Trump's motives, at least in some quarters. If he appoints someone who is regarded as simply a stooge to do the president's bidding, then I think we're very close to being in a constitutional crisis in this country. Lisa Leith, what will it take to get the Republicans to agree to appoint a special prosecutor? Well, two things on that. First of all, as I suggested earlier, a lot of it depends on what the public thinks is going on here. Whether the Republicans need to be paying attention to a constituency that's important to them and that says, look, we have a lot of questions about this. We're going to be very distrustful of you if you don't carry forward with an aggressive investigation of this, and that requires that you have a special prosecutor. But the other thing that we have learned from Republicans is that they do come together behind the president eventually. We saw that during primary season and the election campaign when many Republicans, people such as Paul Ryan, expressed publicly serious doubts about the character of the President of the United States. There were some who went so far as to find him absolutely unacceptable, like poison. And they fought his nomination. But when we got into the election campaign, they came behind him. And on election day, they were there. And since election day with his presidency, they have said things supportive and flattering about him. So what they say, what Republicans say in the immediate flush of the excitement and the shock in some quarters about all of this is not necessarily what they'll be saying about it tomorrow. So that's one of the things we have to watch for. Once again, we're talking about the firing yesterday of the director of the FBI by the President of the United States, something that no president has ever done before when he's been under investigation by the FBI at the same time. It has raised questions about the motivation of the presidency and whether this is heading towards a constitutional crisis. So we're taking your questions here. My name's Keith Boag. I'm a correspondent in the Washington Bureau. If you have comments and I want to share them with the public, I will be happy to do that as well. Who would take James Comey's place? I sort of have signaled that that's a very critical question. We don't know the answer to that. It has been suggested that if it were a stooge, it would be somebody like Rudy Giuliani, who has been way too close to Donald Trump's campaign really to be considered for that job, I think, reasonably. But you could think of other people who might have experience that might be unimpeachable. What, for instance, would people think if the president were to ask Leon Panetta, a Democrat, someone who ran the CIA, who was a former politician, but who has an excellent reputation and is trusted? What if he were to name him? Would that possibly be the type of person that could enjoy the support of both sides of the House? That's just me throwing that out there, but as a way of illustrating that it's not impossible to find somebody who the president could appoint that could settle this issue down somewhat and allow the investigation to proceed. Catherine Schaefer asks, why is this being called a surprise firing? It has been discussed for weeks and weeks by media. Well, first of all, it was surprised because when it happens and you're not expecting it on that day, it was a surprise. But it's also a surprise because there were other opportunities much earlier down the line for Trump to have fired Comey if he wanted to. If his concern about the conduct of James Comey during the election campaign was as serious as it is being made out to be at this moment, why didn't he fire him on January 20th when he became the President of the United States? All of the events that have apparently precipitated the firing of James Comey were things that happened in July and October of 2016. Why did it take 4 months after of Donald Trump's presidency for him to decide that those things, which by the way he had praised vociferously at the time, why did he decide that those same events were now so serious that James Comey could not continue as the director of the FBI? That's why there is surprise about it now. Marchek Mahaffey Dorsey, what can Americans do that is most effective to get an independent prosecutor, since all polls show the vast majority want one? I think I think they have to continue making it clear that the public is involved in this, that it's paying attention, that it has a clear preference for the investigation to continue, that its confidence in an investigation can only be maintained if it's a special prosecutor. But if Republicans decide that that isn't enough for them to appoint a special prosecutor, or they believe that the investigations that are already underway, because there are investigations, congressional investigations underway, are sufficient, then there isn't going to be a special prosecutor. It has been pointed out that the firing of James Comey does not mean the end of the investigation in the FBI. There are still investigators there who can continue to do their work. But it is important to know, or to remember, that the director of the FBI has a lot, I mean, this is obviously probably the most sensitive investigation that the FBI has on its plate today. The investigation of whether there was collusion between the President of the United States election campaign and the Russian government has to be considered the most sensitive file that they have. The leadership of the investigation on that file is extremely important. So while that investigation is underway, and Republicans remind us continually that it is underway, it's reasonable to question whether it can be as effective without a director of the FBI or without even James Comey as it would be with him. Kathy Hellesy asks, where in the world is Kellyanne Conway, which is a reference to Saturday Night Live. I think Kellyanne Conway was on CNN last night, so she is in fact still in town. Okay, so Ken Albin has a comment. He says, the only surprise here is that he didn't fire Comey months ago, but once the Deputy Attorney General recommended it, he followed through in a short order. That's decisive. I added the that's. So far, fantastic. Okay. Zach Grubes, I'm sorry if I've mispronounced that, asks, what is the next step? How does the impeachment process begin? And I like that question because it sort of assumes that the next step, let's get to it kind of thing. Now, the next step, I think, is a discussion about whether there should be a special prosecutor, and I think that has already begun. Whether it has begun formally, I think we'll see later in the day. After that, we need to hear what the nominee for to fill Comey's post is going to be. Then there will be a process whereby that nominee will be either confirmed or not in the Senate. It could be that the circumstances surrounding all of this make the Senate less functional than it was 24 hours ago, and that's something that we have to consider in all of this. But an impeachment, as I understand it, if it were to begin, would begin in the House, where there would be investigations as to whether they're, well, it could begin, in the Clinton case, it began when the special prosecutor Ken Starr filed his report recommending an impeachment. Then the Speaker of the House at that time, Newt Gingrich, made it a priority in the House. They actually filed an election on it. The House decided that they would impeach President Clinton. The impeachment trial was held in the Senate, and Clinton was acquitted. So that's kind of like the template for how the process works, but there are lots of ways in which this could be different, although the actual impeachment process, if we even got that far, is laid out in law. So Jacob Muirhead, how do you think this might look to the rest of the world? Is the international community worried? Well, they should be. Not because I think that the president is guilty or not guilty of anything, but because it adds an element of instability at the very top of the United States government, at least for the moment. The world has been paying attention, probably closer attention to the first 110 days of Donald Trump's presidency than to any other 100 days or 110 days of any presidency in recent memory. And there are all kinds of different reasons why the world has been concerned by Donald Trump's presidency that have to do with uncertainty. I'm not saying that they are concerned because of policy decisions that he has made with regard to anything in the world at all, although they could be. But I think uncertainty itself is something that's concerning to other countries. When they can't predict what the United States is going to do in the world or say in the world, that's of concern to them. When they're uncertain about how stable the government is in a given situation, and the government is not unstable now, but it is, there are signs around it that there could be very serious and dire times ahead. I think that's probably something that reasonable people can be reasonably concerned about at this moment. Thanks for your questions. Brett Hagee asks, how could Redford and Hoffman spin this into a sequel? Yeah, that would be Dustin Hoffman and Robert Redford, who played Woodward and Bernstein in the movie All the President's Men. And I think they're far too old to spin this into a sequel right now, but I'm sure there are young actors out there just waiting to do this. I'm looking for questions here. Democrats ask for all materials related to the firing be preserved by Justice and FBI. Are these departments legally obligated to do so, or are their materials headed for the shredder? I think that, I think that it would be wrong to consider that the FBI is a organization so corrupt that there aren't people inside it that understand at the very base of their legitimacy is how they handle a case like this, how they handle the evidence. If things were going to the shredder, that would be a huge story. And I say that mindful of the fact that during Watergate, there were senior people inside the FBI that were burning documents that reflected on Richard Nixon. So as you can see, I'm actually thinking about that a little bit more seriously than I took the question when I first read it. Let's hope not. How about that? Let's hope not. Okay, Steve Leaks asks, how are you going to impeach when Republicans control the House and the Senate? Again, in the last couple of months, I did a story on that touched on aspects of the impeachment process and talked to a congressman who voted for the impeachment of Richard Nixon. And I met her in New York. She was the youngest person to vote for impeachment at that time. And the single thing that she wanted to impress upon me and that stuck with me is how important it is to have public support for this. It can transcend party lines. There is a limit to how much Republicans can disregard the demands from the public if they try to. As news comes out, and this is a very important development in all of that, because I think it has shaken some people who perhaps were not paying as close attention to what was going on in Washington but now are, or who have deep concerns about the motivation of the president's action yesterday. But the public opinion is extremely important in circumstances like this. My examples of Nixon's being forced from office by the threat of impeachment and Clinton being impeached and yet acquitted both have interesting implications for how public opinion was at that time. Nixon knew that if he were impeached, the impeachment would succeed, but the Congress knew that the public was behind impeachment, and that's why they were prepared to do it. They took that issue very seriously, because replacing or removing a president that has been elected by the people is obviously a very serious thing to do. But they understood that the public was ready for that. A majority of the public eventually was ready for Nixon's removal. And so they felt that they could proceed with the full weight of the Constitution behind them, but also the full weight of the people of the country. And you need both. In the case of Clinton, they didn't have, well, some would argue they didn't have the weight of the Constitution behind them because the grounds on which he was impeached were specious. But they definitely did not have the support of the public behind them. And so even though Democrats, I believe, controlled the Senate at the time, they never had any doubt that they could acquit him and not pay a political price for it, or a price in history. That is where we are in terms of, I think, the question that Republicans are facing now. What does the public think of this? How seriously should they take it? What are the consequences for them politically if they do the wrong thing? How much latitude do they have to do to do something other than what they thought they were going to do yesterday, for instance? These are things that they will, I think, have to think about very carefully. And I hope that the people who are elected to this Congress take as seriously the obligations to the public that the people who were elected in the 1970s did when they were faced with a question like this, which is not to say they should arrive at the same conclusion. It is only to say that they should take their roles in this very, very seriously, because that's what the public expects of them. Do I think how Republicans, this is Zach Fleissig, do I think how Republicans handle this situation will have an effect on congressional elections? I think that it could have, and I think that it's not entirely a cop-out to say that we have to wait and see, because so many important parts of this are unknown. The investigation is happening for a reason, but that does not necessarily mean that the Trump administration is hiding something here. Although their political opponents certainly suspect that, we don't know for a fact that that is true yet. We need to know what comes out of this before we can see what the full impact of it is going to be. But any Republican who is not paying attention to how this is playing in the public and what is changing in the public mood right now is probably not taking very seriously what the consequences of that could be for them in 2018. Midterms are in 2018, by the way. That's just a little aside here. Alexandra Shaw asks, what exactly could Trump be impeached for? There would have to be a reason, not just we don't like you. That's absolutely right. Again, the lesson of the Clinton impeachment is you better have good grounds for impeachment, because the public will the public has to be persuaded that the president has committed a high crime or misdemeanor. That is the language that's used for impeachment, removal of a president for high crimes and misdemeanor. Generally what that means is that he has committed a crime, or his behavior is such that it amounts to an abuse of his power or of his authority. In the case of Clinton, they thought they could build a case that he had obstructed justice in the investigation of his relationship with Monica Lewinsky. That is certainly one of the things that we are hearing in the language of Democrats, at least, after what happened yesterday, that it has the smell of obstruction of justice about it. And that would, if that case were solid, that would be considered an abuse of office. So those are the terms that would have to be satisfied. No, not just because they don't like him. They would have to have a solid case that he had abused the power of his office, the authority of his office, to obstruct justice. That's where the discussion would have to go, and I don't want to say that that's where we are at yet. Yeah, Jeanette Sear-Couture, it seems to me that the Republican Party will put up with anything and everything this president does just to keep in power. That's a comment, not a question. The Trump family, Sherry Robinson says, the Trump family is breaking the emoluments clause. Why are the Republicans allowing this? There are a lot of circumstances which do seem to be pretty clear that the Trump family is breaking the emoluments clause. Every time that the president goes to Mar-a-Lago on the weekend and describes it at the White House, one can be fooled into thinking that's a public building. It's not. It's not only not a public building, it's not even his private home. It's a business that he goes to every weekend. And there are serious questions raised about that by some Republicans and a lot of Democrats. But these circumstances are something that Republicans perhaps have overlooked in these early days of the Trump administration, because they see that the president has the support of a certain constituency out there, and that he has been able to, in some ways, fulfill some of their legislative wishes, or in particular, with his appointment to the Supreme Court, his longer lasting impacts on what will happen in the United States. He's behaving in the way, some of his behavior in public may cause Republicans to cringe, but when you actually strip that away, he's getting rid of the regulations they don't like. He's appointing a Supreme Court nominee they do like. They think they can get him to do something on health care that's more like what they wanted than it is like what he wanted or said he wanted during the campaign. Those are reasons that might suggest why they're willing to overlook other things. The question is, can they overlook them forever? And the answer is what we will find out in the course of his administration, I suppose. Let me look for more questions here. So John Sweda says the Senate are doing their own investigations with Trump and Russia. What's happening about this? You know, they started with a lot of tough talk about how they were going to work together in a bipartisan way, and that was encouraging to people who felt that the House investigation to these same things had become too partisan. But they've actually gone off to quite a slow start. What we saw this week with the testimony from Sally Yates was really the beginning of the Senate getting into this in a higher profile way and asking some of the difficult questions that surround all of this. So that's where that is. And we really don't know enough yet about where that's going to go, how aggressive that investigation is going to be in order to judge whether it's going to be, well, I mean, ultimately the public will judge whether it's satisfied by the aggressiveness or the intensity or the objectivity or the integrity of the Senate. But I guess what I'm suggesting is that at this point, it is like many other things, unfortunately, too soon to tell. Shirley's hope in comments, I can only hope that there is a younger version of Woodward and Bernstein out there somewhere. Yes, we hope that's true for lots of reasons, not just this story, just because we need a new we need young and vital journalists out there. But I would add to that, you know, I think they are out there. I think there's a lot of really good stuff happening in journalism right now. And I think one of the unintended consequences of the Trump presidency is that it has provoked more good journalism rather than less good journalism, as many had feared. Maybe we will be proved wrong on that. Let's hope not. Laurie McPhee, how likely is it that this firing, the Russian investigation, can be shut down? That with this firing, the Russian investigation can be shut down? You know, sunlight is the greatest disinfectant, I think. There are a lot of people watching what happens next. We are told that the White House was unprepared for the reaction that this received in the hours after the president's decision was made public. That they weren't, the evidence seems to be that they weren't well prepared with the communications line on how to handle it, which suggests that they weren't prepared for it. And I think to some degree that means they weren't prepared for the scrutiny either. Greater scrutiny is what will drive the continued investigation and the integrity of that investigation. And the Trump administration needs to be very mindful of that. I'm sorry, allow me a moment here. Tom Blondeel asks, do you see this as an abuse of presidential power? You know, it's not something that I think that's a really good question. I think that's the question that people are asking now. Is this a presidential abuse of power? I think it's too early, again, to answer that question. The White House has offered one explanation as to why they acted, when they acted, and the reasons behind their decision. That explanation for events is being challenged by both Democrats and some Republicans. And I think it's, you know, this is at a crucial stage now in terms of what happens next. You know, I'm sorry to keep coughing out and saying something that sounds too cliche, like only time will tell. But in fact, only time will tell. We are, again, at the very beginning of this. Let me just remind you, we're talking about the firing of James Comey as the director of the FBI yesterday, and what are the consequences of that for the Trump administration, and also for the investigation that is ongoing by the FBI into the possibility that the Trump campaign during the election last year was in collusion with the government of Russia. Now, the next step in all of this will or could have a tremendous impact in shaping how people view it, and that, I think, is the well, a possible next step would be the nomination by the president of someone to take over at the FBI, and the quality, caliber, character, reputation, and history of that person will be very important, and people make a decision as to whether this looks like the president trying to hide something and derail the investigation, or whether you know, his appointment suggests that you know, he really was acting on the advice of the Deputy Attorney General, who said the FBI can't function with James Comey any longer, and we need to replace him in order to restore our ability to do our jobs as well as our integrity and our reputation. Only if the president nominates someone to take over from James Comey, who is, as I say, unimpeachably honest and of unimpeachable integrity in the eyes of not just Republicans but Democrats, will that lower the pressure around questions as to his motivation. Yeah, I've been flipping up and down here. James Donovan asks, why did Comey get to fly back on the FBI jet from LA? Who paid for the flight? I'm not sure, you know, I happen to know something about that airplane, which is a charter jet. I'm not sure, and if you want to get back to me on that, you know that it's the FBI plane. I actually checked out that flight last night to see where it came from, and it's a charter plane that I think arrived from somewhere in South Carolina to pick him up there. Now, I might be wrong about that, and I don't know who paid for it, although it doesn't seem to me to be an unreasonable thing that having flown him out there on business, that there is some responsibility for his employer to bring him back to his home, even if they fired him in the interim. Paul St. Amand says, Trump's clumsy attempt to exonerate himself in his letter to Comey may reveal wrongdoing. Is it not improper for the FBI director to assure the president he's not a target of an ongoing investigation? Well, you know, I think we only have Trump's version of that to go by, with Trump saying, you know, that I appreciate, in his letter yesterday to Comey, he said, I appreciate that you have, and I'm paraphrasing, I appreciate that you have 3 times confirmed that I'm not under investigation. We know from following this president through the course of his short administration that his version of, or his interpretation, or his parsing of someone else's words is not necessarily consistent with what just about anybody else would glean from them. So I don't know how to answer a question about whether what Trump says Comey said to him was inappropriate for Comey to say to him, when we don't know Comey actually said what Trump says to him, other than from Donald Trump. And it's unfortunate that we have learned that we cannot trust Trump's version of events, even when they happen in front of the general public. Forgive me here, I just want to make sure that I'm not going to toss up questions that I've answered already or that I'm unable to answer. Comey said he was unable to give, this is Daniel Johnston, Comey said he was unable to give answers during his testimony last week because of much of it being classified. There were requests for closed sessions to have these questions answered. Is Comey able to divulge classified information now that he has been fired? I think that the answer to that is complicated, but the short answer, I believe, is no. He's no longer the director of the FBI. He cannot authorize himself to declassify classified information. But I think that there's still an open question as to whether, in a closed setting, he can talk about things that he could have talked about before. I hope that's not confusing, but let me explain to you why I say that. In the testimony we heard from Sally Yates, who was Deputy Attorney General and also fired by Donald Trump this year, we heard from her in testimony in front of committee yesterday. And it seemed to me that she was suggesting there were things that she could say in private to the committee that she could not say in public. It's not entirely clear to me what that means in terms of how that information might have been classified. And I think those distinctions are probably finer and legalistically finer than I'm capable of answering. But I think that there are important questions. What does James Comey know that might be of value to the committee, and how free is he to tell what he knows? And you know, I appreciate you asking that question, even if I can't give a full answer to it. But it's a question I'd certainly like the answer to as well. Emily Valdock asks, what if anything has Comey said on this today? So far, I don't think he said anything on this today. And if you know otherwise, because I'm just talking to you, send me a note and I'll tell everybody about it. Suzanne Dion says, this is like watching House of Cards, 24 and Survivor all at once. Who needs a Netflix subscription when there's American politics? Yeah, keep watching right here. It's better than any of those shows. Michelle Williams asks, what are your thoughts on the fact that Comey apparently learned of this firing via news report rather than being informed by Trump himself? You know, obviously it's unfortunate for Comey to find out in the way that he did. But I think even more revealing is that it speaks to the lack of preparation around all of this. Why was it that the White House didn't know where the director of the FBI was when they were in the process of firing him? How much preparation did they have? You know, we know that the Deputy Attorney General who made the case for firing Comey was only confirmed in his job 2 weeks ago. It seems to have been his #1 priority. And why is that? There are questions around those things being asked by Democrats today. But I think that the stark unpreparedness of the White House in releasing this information and in not being aware of where the person they were firing was actually at the time they were firing him, I think all of that speaks to some interesting weaknesses in the way that they've handled this file so far. So I'm not sure how much longer we have to go here. I suggest not very long because I have to go. If you have any more questions, I'm happy to answer them, but I think that I have got okay, so here's a good question. Richard Shadow asks, would it not be a bigger scandal if he ignored the letter from the Attorney General? You know, that might be a story all on its own. There are other ways that this can be handled, though. You know, I mean, supposing they had decided that they, instead of just abruptly firing him the way that they did, the president acknowledged receipt of the recommendation from the Attorney General and had a conversation with James Comey and said publicly, I'm going to talk to the director about this, and then had the conversation with him, after which James Comey came out and said, you know, in all sincerity, you know, I've listened to the arguments made by the Deputy Attorney General. I've listened to what the President of the United States has asked of me, and I understand what the public expects of the FBI, therefore I'm resigning. You would have, I think, a somewhat different story today than the one that we have. Whether it was possible for him to ignore the Deputy Attorney General's recommendation, he is the President of the United States. He can ignore it if he chooses to. Okay, so as I'm being told that I don't see any more questions there. I appreciate the ones that you've asked. I hope that at least some of you are satisfied by the answers that I've tried to give to you. And I hope we meet again in this format. Thanks for joining us. And that's it for me. Keith Boag in Washington, and you out there in Facebook. Take care.